Thank you, Dennis, very much. Before we go to a general discussion, you mentioned Bounty, and I think I just wanted to tell you that Avatopia, which is a new nursery here in California, actually imported Bounty from South Africa. And it's just finished going through the mandatory quarantine requirement. So trees on Bounty probably will not be available for probably 2 to 3 years. But we will have it in California, and I'm sure then it will be going out in trial. But now people have something very exciting to look forward to. So Bounty is a rootstock from South Africa.
Yep.
So there was one other question I wanted to scroll back up here that I thought you could answer right away. Oh, so we have a question about the mole drain that you talked about. They want to know the size of the torpedo plug and what is the horsepower is needed to pull the thing through the field.
Good question. The size of the mole, the plug itself, is about 4 to 5 inches in diameter, and you probably need about 100 horsepower vehicle. Tractor's better. If it's on rubber tracks, it's probably better, but wheeled 4x4 wheeled tractors of about 100 horsepower will do it, because it's just a single time.
Great. And then the other question is Orindus registered in Australia yet?
What is registered?
Orindus. Probably not, because you don't know what it is.
I don't know what it is, so it may be registered, but maybe very new.
Yeah, it's a fungicide here in the United States. It's being marketed by Syngenta. Fatima might be able to get a little bit more detail, but it was first registered on citrus for Phytophthora. That work was done by Jim Atascavage at UC Riverside, and then he followed up with work on avocado. And about a year ago now, Orindus was registered, and it's a very effective fungicide that can be applied through the irrigation system.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, I'll look into that, see if it's available. Yeah.
So do we have any, so we're open up for discussion. Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask any of the speakers? I'm not sure if Ben is on as well. Any questions? So Fatima, I have a question for you or Gary or Dennis. Is given that, well, I guess it would be for you and Gary, given that we have Orindus registered, how long would you wait after a flooding event or a heavy waterlogging event before you would apply Orindus, given that you're putting it through the irrigation system? Do you think that's something you would have to have on only before something would happen?
Well, I'd say, in my opinion, I think it should go on like right away. But you don't need to put it through a whole lot of water. I probably wouldn't run it more than 3 hours or so, turn the water off. By the way, mention on clay soils, many of you have been to our high density avocado trial at the Staley Ranch, and that's a clay soil with a lot of rock in it. And they are very careful about their irrigation. They only do about 3-hour irrigation with 14 gallon an hour sprinklers, probably 3 to 4 hours, and then they turn it off. And then, but they during the summer, of course, when it's really hot, they'll come in and repeat that probably every third day or so. And those trees are doing great. Where in the past, we had a consultant here who was recommending 24-hour irrigations because we had such a salt problem. And that gets rid of the salt, but it also created a lot of waterfalls coming out of groves, which is creating a hypoxia condition. So it didn't really increase the yield as promised, So I think we've probably gotten away from that 24-hour irrigation. At least I hope so. Okay, that's all.
Okay, so we have a question on chat. I think I'm interpreting the question correctly. Is what is the best approach to mitigate the potential of flooding if you know that they have a forecast for a heavy rain or a flooding event? Is there something that you can do like within a couple days of an event that they predict heavy rain and you know that you're, because you can't always have perfect soil. You'll have pockets of heavy soil and you feel that that would mitigate that issue. Maybe that would be a good one for Dennis.
Sorry, just repeat that question. I didn't hear it.
The question is, if you see in the forecast that there's going to be 12 inches of rain, or
Yeah.
Is there anything that you can do in the few days before a flooding event to help prepare the trees?
Yeah, look, there are some products that people spray on their trees. I'm not sure if they work. Yeah, I think that the only thing you can really do is try and remove any physical impediments to surface water runoff. You know, if you see any depressions or anything like that, try and open them up to allow the water to run off. I think that's probably what you can do.
Yeah, so I know in the picture I showed earlier is at Lynn Cove, and we have the problem down at the bottom of the field, exactly what you talked about, is that there's a road right at the bottom of the field. And you can see where the water just ponds. It was like a little lake after all the rain we had in California. And what the manager at Lynn Cove did is he took he ripped the soil because there's another, and you could see the water was just gushing in this canal ditch that it was amazing to see the water running off. And even last week when there's no standing water anymore, there's water in that ditch.
Right. Yeah. So I guess that's what you could do is you're going to destroy your road in the process, but you could rip through the compacted areas, through the road. It's probably going to result in the road washing away, but at least you'll get the water out of the orchard.
Thank you, Dennis. Do we have any other questions? Everybody's quiet today.
Well, Fatima brought up something that I thought was kind of interesting, whether or not you should prune the tree before or after. I think what did you say on that?
Yeah, and whether it's I don't know. Do you, Dennis, in Australia, do you have such a thing? I know in Florida,
no, we usually don't prune before the flooding event because simply because we're never 100% sure how much rain we're going to get. But yeah, we do prune afterwards though.
Yeah, I mean, scientifically speaking, it makes sense to prune after flooding. Before flooding, as I mentioned, we only had this assumption that it could be because of the lack of enough carbohydrates for roots. Trees didn't recover, but the experiment was done on this subject, was done in containers, not necessarily out in the orchards. So maybe more research should be done on it.
So we have a question, Herman. You need to unmute yourself.
Hi guys. Yes, so I had a comment and a question, and the first comment would tie into what Fatima said about root rot and Phytophthora root rot. A comment is that I think it's commonly mistaken that you walk into the fields, the leaves look wilted, and you dig up some roots and you see root rot. And the first assumption is it's Phytophthora. So I actually had that same experience in a field about 2 weeks ago. I walked a Hass and Dusa orchard that was planted in the fall of last year. And then, of course, with all the rain we had, it just stayed waterlogged and the roots was rotten. So immediately I started raising red flags to the farmer. We got to dive in, we got to look, and we've got to figure out. I have a plant pathology background, so I just said it's possibly Phytophthora. We got to look into it. So my question would be, the farmers, if they walk their fields now and they do see evidence of root rot, where can they go to analyze and to detect a Phytophthora or not, the presence of root diseases or not?
A great question for Fatima.
I mean, that's a very good point. Yes, it is confusing. If you go there and you dig the ground and look at the roots, as I showed also in that picture for Duke 7, you see the roots pretty much showing the same symptoms because roots are dead, right? The black brittle. But look at those feeder roots for Phytophthora. Pay attention to those feeder roots. Usually Phytophthora, I mean, you should correct me, I mean, others here, affects the feeder roots and they're gone. And you see that major one, maybe compared to the waterlogging situation. Consider that one. And the next, as a plant pathologist, running a lab here, send some samples to be tested to see whether we can isolate Phytophthora from or not. Other than that, canopy decline or the way that you see roots are affected could be a bit confusing. I mean, Gary can comment and Dennis or Meridu, but that's what I think.
Is it a commercial service? And if you don't mind me asking, the cost of having a sample?
No, it's not. It's actually, I'm based in the university, not that we do officially any diagnostics, we don't have any diagnostic program here, but if growers are dealing with something and they don't know what it is, feel free to send samples either to my lab or Patty Manosalva. She mainly works with Phytophthora root rot. She could also look into those roots and see whether you have it or not.
Excellent. I'll send you a sample in the next week. Thank you.
Sure.
I'd like to comment, maybe be careful about nursery trees. Most of our nurseries here in California are clean now, but we recently had a problem at a nursery, and the trees coming out from that nursery had Phytophthora cinnamomum, and the grower bought a lot of trees, and half of them they got planted and they didn't look very good at all, and they looked like they had Phytophthora on the roots, but the other half, they're still in the pots and they look bad. So you can, in that case, we did take it up to UC Riverside to the lab, and they said it was positive for Phytophthora. So in that case, since it hasn't been planted, you can make a case to the nursery to possibly refund your money or something like that. And but once they're planted, the nurseries say, well, it probably came from your own ground. So, and I've come across several instances where the trees had not been planted yet, and they had the problem. So, but like the question was, where do you take it? You really need to take it to the lab if you can, and it is confusing sometimes after a rain event, because the roots do look black, and just like the picture that Fatima showed there, they look like PC, so it needs to go to a lab.
Gary, how about feeder roots? With waterlogging also we see feeder roots are gone, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
We have a,
Sorry, can I just make a comment that the symptoms of trees with too much water and the symptoms of trees with too little water are very similar, and so it can be confusing sometimes as to when to turn on your irrigation again. So it's important to have soil water measurement so that you don't turn on the irrigation too late. I've seen some people do that. So the trees have the double whammy of being waterlogged, then the waterlogging subsides, and the trees then start suffering drought conditions because of their loss of roots, and the tree just suffers even further. So you just got to be aware of that.
Derek, you have a question?
Yeah, good to see you, Dennis. Thanks.
Yeah, nice to see you, Derek.
Early morning.
Yeah.
There are two different areas. One question is for Dennis. When you're sampling for phosphorus acid in the roots, are you asking for samples of phosphorus acid or phosphorus, or what are you asking a lab to do?
No, there's a lab in Australia that that detects phosphites
Hmm.
in the root samples. So you just collect a sample of roots, send it into the lab. They'll tell you what the level of phosphites are.
So for our experts, we probably couldn't send roots to Australia. Do we have any labs other than our own UCR or somebody that could sample for phosphite levels if that's one of the products that we're using?
That's a great question. I don't know, Gary or
No.
Fatima, do you have an answer?
I don't think we do.
I'm not aware of, but we could ask around and let maybe knows.
At this point, that's our number one product that's being used for Phytophthora root rot control in the States. We're fiddling with the Rondus. We're glad to have it, but that's still our primary thing. It was very interesting to hear 90 to 150, you know, actually have some markers that you're getting enough into your trees and your roots at the right time. So that gives us a target to work with rather than just tossing it on.
Yeah, it just makes it a little bit more scientific.
Yeah, and you know, you're getting your bang for your buck. We have people here that believe no phosphites are taken up really in the leaf in California. Maybe it's our different weather or, you know, the cambial layers. I don't know. But it's generally in the water, in irrigation.
Yeah.
So second comment I had is that when Fatima was getting onto the let's cut the trees back and match our shoot to root ratio, well, that's really an unknown, and each avocado is an individual to me, and they respond a different way. So our first, and I believe our first reactions and advice from our advisors is to just hold back for a bit. Hold on, wait and see what you got after a flooding event, and then go to work. You need to divide small trees, or, you know, a year to two old trees are a whole different beast than what Dennis was showing on a mature grove and a cutback. My experience is about on the mature trees, about 50% success. I don't know if Dennis or Herman have tried, but that's generally where we're at on a 20 to 40-year-old tree. On a baby, when you cut that wood, you also introduce wounds, and I can't tell after a flooding event if it's dying from the bottom up or the top down. So you got to be really careful on a small tree cutback, which is everybody's tendency. Let's save what we can.
Yeah,
Derek, we find that young trees actually handle because we're planting on ridges, the young orchards are all on ridges. The young trees actually handle the flooding quite well. We didn't lose many trees in the young trees, but the older trees, they suffer big time because they're not planted on ridges.
Herman, you have another question?
Yes, I want to mention that I think AGQ Labs could possibly do that analysis for phosphites. I think globally for sure. I'm not sure in California if they have the instruments available, but it's definitely worth looking up for them. And then I don't want to change the topic completely, but is it true that there's no nematode risk really for avocados in California? I've seen a 50-year-old study for a lesion nematode in Ventura, but I'm quite sure it could have developed, or there could be other nematodes. Is that not a problem?
My understanding is it's not perceived that there's a nematode problem in California, but that's a great question. And I will check with Oli Becker, who's our extension nematologist, and just confirm that there's no problems with nematodes in California. But they've always said that we've had meetings within extension many years ago. Gary probably remembers. But, you know, the perception has always been that there is not a nematode problem in California.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
But, you know, you never know.
I think my last comment is that I want to emphasize the importance of soil classification. If you do a very good soil classification of your field, you're able to at least know which areas are prone to waterlogging and anoxic conditions and inevitably then root rot conditions. So soil classification before planting and after planting can really be very beneficial.
Thank you very much for that comment. So Fatima, I'm sorry I cut you off. Did you have a comment earlier?
I guess it flew away. Oh yeah, that was regarding the pruning. So what Derek mentioned, if I understood correctly, so you're mentioning that you gotta wait after flooding, not right after flooding, you gotta go and do any pruning. You wait a little bit to see how trees react.
Was that for
Okay.
Derek Knoble?
Yeah, that was for Derek, or in general, if anyone can.
Yeah, well, usually after a flooding event, it's hysteria anyway, and you don't have time, but you as a farmer are looking, what can I do to help my poor little tree that's showing these symptoms or definitely has black roots? What am I gonna do? I gotta do something. And I believe Keith Escalin and Gary and Ben Faber all just said kind of, oh, don't, these are younger plantings, of course, not much you can do right now. Protect it from sunburn, do some other things, but don't get too active on the pruning right away. And I'm saying weeks to months, but your tendency is like, if I can do something, I'm going to try. And often that wasn't, it didn't really pay dividends. I noticed when, let's say I had a nursery potted tree fitted in there, and I looked for green wood after a week, and then I cut back at the green wood, then it would continue to die back because it's in such a state of stress, or maybe you're introducing some of the Dithyrellus or the other fungi into it, and then before you know it, the tree's gone dead below the graft line or right at the graft line. So that I'm just sharing what my experience is. This is the cafe. It's not scientific, but hands off, like after a freeze, I guess.
Yeah,
It's
I was just gonna make that comment that it sounds very much like the approach that we recommend for after a freeze is give the tree a chance to try to recover before you start cutting back on it. But how soon would you go in with some whitewashing or anti-transparent or something to protect the wood? If the tree is losing its leaves, obviously you need to go in and protect the wood from sunburning.
Two things. That's something you can do right away, but you're usually stuck in the muck buck. So it's pretty hard. You got to get backpacks, you got to get paint cans and get going. But that's something you can do right away. The first thing I would do, and we use mulch culture here a lot, and if it's one of those atmospheric rivers, 32 rivers coming in and constantly wet, we had to rake our mulch away just to let the plants breathe a little bit. And it was kind of a fine mulch like we get out of the composters here. But you got to watch that mulch as well, because it does trap a lot of water cross slope all the time. That's what we had to do right away. And then we went after it with sunburn materials, and we tried nutrients and things like that.
I just want to make another comment regarding the pruning. So the idea was originally based on experience and observations. Like people were probably in southern Florida desperate to do, and they would try all this. Sometimes it would work, sometimes it wouldn't, depending on the rootstock or science. But I found one experiment done in containers, and the results come from that one that was, along with what people based on experience and observation found in Florida. But I personally believe we should do more research on such topic and then, recommend it to growers.
Well, I think another very important point is the fact that there's probably great differences between rootstocks. And I think that doing research to just sort of screen new rootstocks for flooding tolerance would probably be quite useful, but we don't know if there's a sign rootstock interaction as well. It appeared, at least at Lynn Cove, where we have at least 3 different varieties down at the bottom of the field that's heavily impacted, that unfortunately our friend Hass was the most severely affected. But, you know, we don't have any of those answers.
How does DUSA do, out of curiosity, based on your experience in the orchard?
That field is DUSA.
Oh,
My
Okay.
field was DUSA.
okay, good.
Not so good.
Yeah, but you know, I mean, DUSA is grown very widely in California, and it's a great rootstock for other reasons. So, you know, you have to be.
Yeah, it is. I remember Dr. John Mengi, he was studying root flushing avocados, and he said the feeder roots here in California usually flushed in May and then again in September. And the root flushing alternates with leaf growth. So I kind of agree with Derek. I think you've got a certain amount of starch reserves in these trunks for growth, and I think the first priority in a tree is to grow some new feeder roots here, and then after that's taken care of, then start to grow the top. So I would kind of do what Derek was suggesting, just wait, and when you for later on to do some pruning and prune out the branches that are dying. But I'm not a physiologist, and I think that would be a really interesting study to do on some mature trees.
You know, in that study that I'm telling you, when they would prune right after flooding, they would see recovery in those physiological responses that I talked about, like carbon dioxide absorption would be better, stomata would reopen better and faster, you know, based on those. Yeah, I guess that study came out just because of those results. But again, you know, we got to do more research and see whether it works for our orchards right after. Yeah.
Just a quick comment there, guys. In my opinion, an avocado tree needs to put on leaf almost before it puts on root, because the pump of the tree is the leaves to get water out of the soil. And even though there's fewer roots available, there will still be roots alive that can act as the pump, but you need the leaves to pump that water.
But the thing is, the first response to flooding is stomata are closed, and transpiration comes down because of that. You know, immediate maybe response of trees. I mean, that's a very good comment. It's true. We need these.
But this is post flooding.
Yes.
After the water is gone, when the
Sure.
trees start, they lose all their leaves. Then you got to decide how do you get those leaves back, and often just to prune them and get some and shoot growth, and then that often helps.
Good. Yeah.
I'm going to ask a question. I put something in the chat, but I think you might have missed it. And part of that has to do with I've lost some topsoil with the flooding. I was wondering if I should put chips over the top of it, mulch over the top of the exposed roots. I don't know. I think that it's been long enough that those roots probably died, and deeper ones are starting up. But and then just one other question has to do with in terms of applying things to help with the roots or the flushing the leaves. I mean, is there an order you would suggest in terms of whether to start with the nitrogen for the leaves, or to start with phosphite to get the roots going, or is there some order you would suggest for getting the nutrients going?
All of the above. Yeah, you've got to throw. It's going to be a shotgun approach. You can try everything to just get these trees to grow
And cover up those roots. Mulch would probably be okay, I suppose.
Yeah.
Do you have a comment, Fatima, to what Dana had to say?
You know, I know that he's asking about the fertilizers or anything that we apply, right? When to apply them? That was the question.
Mm-hmm.
The order, I'm not sure really about the order, but of course, because of leaching and, water would go away, we will lack some nutrients also, and it would be good to use some other fertilizers, but we gotta be careful about the amount that we put in. But regarding the order, I can't make any comment at this point.
So, I mean, in terms of the fungicides, if you know you have an orchard that has root rot, which is probably most orchards everywhere. If you don't have any feeder roots, it doesn't make sense to spend a lot of money and put in a Rindus application because you're putting it through the irrigation system. But I think Dennis mentioned earlier, you perhaps, even though the leaves are impaired, you could still go in with a phosphite foliar application.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, what do you think about that idea? I mean, if you have root rotted and the O spores are swimming out there and infecting whatever roots are left, don't you think that would be a good idea?
You asking me?
I'm asking one of the three of you.
Yeah, usually vehicle movement in the orchard is impaired after a flood event.
That's true.
You'd like to get your phos acid sprays on as soon as possible after the flood, but sometimes it's 2 or 3 weeks before you can get in. And but you've got to try and get some phos acid into the tree as soon as possible after the flooding event.
Well, that's why we went to that's why trunk injection became so popular.
Yeah.
Because there were just no feeder roots to pick it up. You could put it on the soil, but it's not going to get taken up. So the phosphite goes in the xylem stream up to the leaves, turns around, comes back down to the roots. I mean, there's a time just about you could not walk into an orchard without seeing trunk injection.
Yeah.
What do you think about I mean, this may sound completely outlandish and you can say so, but how about flying it on?
I don't know if you could get the volumes.
True.
You need a good volume of spray to cover the tree. And I don't think flying it on, you're going to get the volumes. Maybe with a helicopter, but not with fixed wing. Or drones. Drones are also low volume applicators.
The helicopters do a really good job, the downwash, and it kind of comes back up, so you're coating both sides of the leaves.
And the helicopter will dry out the soil to a certain extent as well, with the downdraft of the helicopter. There'll be some evaporation of soil water from that.
Well, that's an expensive way to dry up your soil.
Tell me about it. So I think it's only in New Zealand that they use it.
Oh my goodness. Now, I don't know anything about this, but someone asked in the chat about soil surfactants increasing drainage rates. I've never even heard of a soil surfactant. Have you ever heard of that, Dennis?
Gypsum.
Well, gypsum, okay,
Oh.
gypsum, but
I've had lots of salesmen come in my office with soil surfactants, and a lot of them are of unknown origin. It's like,
The snake oil salesman.
Snake oil, yeah, exactly. All kinds of soil surfactants, and in our case, we didn't really need it because we have good drainage. But gypsum is the best. It gets the calcium in there, and it's not really going to change the pH of the soil. So that's a good one.
yeah, I mean, we have another comment that came to me about there has been quite a bit of work on flooding over the years. Some of it is older, like work by Stolze, who used to be in the soils department at Riverside. He looked at Mexicola seedlings, and he was one of the first to talk about this soil aeration requirement of avocados being high. And then we have what I mentioned earlier, this paper by Raul Ferreira and Solis and Pilar Hill from Chile that is actually a very nice paper. And Pilar did her PhD thesis on water status and water management in trees. And then I was reminded of the work that Bruce Schaefer from the University of Florida also did some work on flooding many years ago. And he describes more of the physiological response of the reduced photosynthesis, et cetera, that occurs in the leaves. And the fact that the cupping of the leaves actually is an ethylene response. When the trees are subjected to flooding, it triggers the enzyme, that a precursor to ethylene, ACC, to build up in the plant, and then that's converted to ethylene, and ethylene is actually causes the cupping of the leaves. So it's a very complex interaction that triggers a lot of different pathways that are not normally expressed in the avocado tree or other plants. It's a typical response to plants to flooding. So what we see, the avocado has a high soil oxygen requirement, but the response that you see to flooding is very typical to other plants. So John Jaffone is here. Did you want to say something, John?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, great. Yeah, I'm in a computer that's a little bit old, but I was going to comment on pruning. I think it's a little bit drastic because you induce certain responses within the tree, not only offsetting the root shoot balance in terms of carbon uptake and things like that. But yeah, I'm glad you just mentioned the ethylene issue, because that's the primary, one of the premier responses is that ethylene production, which ultimately will cause leaf drop. A question was asked about fertilizing. I think you need to be very cautious about adding more fertilizers in case electrical conductivity in the root zone also goes up, and that's going to create more problems than you need. The other thing is in terms of mitigation, what we do here in citrus in South Texas is actually make up drainage ditches during flood irrigation, but also during rain events to move that surface water away fast enough so there is no standing water. I think that will get the water away from the root zone faster. Then the newer thing now is using raised beds. And I remember Ben Faber has some plots when I visited it last time with raised beds. That helps a lot in keeping those roots aerated enough. Gypsum, yes, it helps with the drainage, flocculation and things like that, but ultimately, if the soil already, if the site already has a hard pan at some level, it's not going to help get that water away as fast as you need. So there are a variety of solutions that can be made. As far as rootstocks, as you mentioned before, we tried DUSA here and it collapsed very fast, at least with the type of, with the strain of Phytophthora that we have here, which is mostly cotton root rot. So varieties, I think we need to keep looking. Maybe it's going to end up being a gene that controls that ethylene, but also ABA production to help the tree tolerate, as Dennis mentioned before. I think tolerance is the ultimate solution as far as genetic solutions to this. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Dennis made a very important point, though, when he talked about on the planting on the berms, especially for us in California that have slopes. Is the very first time I went to Chile, I remember being astounded that the berms went up and down the hills rather than on the contour. But as I visited Chile more and talked to them, exactly what Dennis said, that, you know, if you're gonna have heavy rain events, you need to get that water away from the trees as quickly as possible. And if you have contour berms, you potentially can impede that water flow. But I don't know, Dennis, if you want to expound on that a little bit more.
Yeah, we had serious floods in 2013 and 2011. And during those floods, it was one of the conclusions that came out was don't worry about planting on the contour. All you do is you impede the runoff of water. And your priority as an avocado farm or as an avocado farmer is to get water out of that orchard as fast as possible. And if that means planting straight down the hill, so be it. We plant straight down the hill.
And Dennis, you would also agree, I think in South Africa, that seems to be common practice, berms up in this Tsenin area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I think most new plantings now are on berms. I don't know of anybody who's not planting on berms. They're just distinct advantages all the way around to planting on berms.
I think
Right.
as Mary Lee, you mentioned that in coming up, we'll also talk about technology. So berms, I agree with Dennis, new plantings should be on berms, but also if one of the things the citrus people are doing here is not only berms, but also ground cover, not just with mulch, wood mulch, but ground with fabric.
And what's the
covers.
purpose of that, John? So for weeds or?
It's weeds, it's moisture retention. It keeps the soil warmer in the spring, so those feeder roots actually get started a lot earlier. I think that Derek mentioned getting those feeder roots going before the leaves, even before the buds break. It's important. So I think that's one of the things that might qualify as newer technologies or management practices.
Thank you, John.
Perhaps I can jump in there. I have clients in China that use plastic mulch under avocado trees. And my opinion is that you are restricting the amount of nutrient that the feeder roots can get out of the leaf litter and the organic mulch that you apply. I don't like plastic mulches in avocados because of that reason.
How about these sort of like cloth-like ones? When I was in Spain last year, we went to a grove where they had a ground cover, but it wasn't solid plastic. It was more of a mesh.
Like a woven plastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen that as well. The feeder roots struggle to grow through it. I just don't like that physical barrier between the feeder roots and the leaf litter, because you're destroying one of the biggest advantages of those feeder roots for the tree.
So the ones that they use here in citrus are breathable. This is the fabric cover, so it's not solid plastic.
Do the roots grow through the plastic?
They're breathable, so water can go through, oxygen can go through. It would impede weed growth.
Yeah, I'm talking about that humus layer that you get between the leaf litter and the soil. The roots must grow into that humus layer.
Oh no, the plastic, the cover is on top of the soil itself. So
but John, I think what he's talking about, in avocado trees, you build up this really beautiful layer of decaying leaf mulch. And if you go into an older grove, what you see is the feeder roots are growing right at that interface of the decaying leaf mulch. And I think, as Dennis is alluding to, you can actually see the feeder roots growing into that layer. And if you have some kind of cover on, you may not be able to get that wonderful interaction that occurs between the leaf mulch and the feeder roots.
And that's true. Physiologically, I think those roots are actually going after that high oxygen zone that is in that area. So with this material being breathable, I don't see that's going to impede root proliferation in that zone.
Well, I
Yeah,
guess that's another experiment to do.
absolutely.
So I had a question though on these artificial mulches, and maybe Derek could have a perspective on this based from what we heard about sustainability at the meeting in New Zealand, is that we're putting all this plastic into a grove. What is that doing to the carbon footprint and the sustainability aspect? And I thought maybe Derek could have a comment on that one.
You put me on the spot there, Mary Lou. Sustainability has many contexts. You know, definitely plastic came up, especially on the, you know, it's about what you're putting in and taking out and finding the balance. And the kiwi fruit growers were especially concerned, you know, they market in plastic clamshells. And can we find other products to do it? So everybody, all I can say is that at the Congress, it was pretty hot topic all the way around. And you do what you can do and you do what you have control over, but you have a plan doing it. And rather than willy-nilly. That's about all I can add on sustainability. As far as I'm concerned, I'm trying to deal with 32 atmospheric rivers. And all I can say, in California, it came and was timed very nice. So it was super sustainable rain. It's a gift that keeps on giving, but had it all come at once, we would have seen a lot more impacted groves that are in some of the heavier soil types, because we didn't have a sustainable amount of oxygen on our roots. And that's something we've got to do better at measuring, or as some of the speakers are saying, preparing the ground that you're going into. Or making sure you're not going into low oxygen where you're going to see dead roots in 24 to 48 hours.
Well, thank you very much, Derek, for that perspective. I don't see any more questions in chat. Do we have any other comments from any of our speakers or from anybody in the audience?
I just
Herman.
want to open the topic on berming heights, or the, you know, how tall the berm should be, because in South Africa it's referred to as ridges for good reason, because it's literally ridges. It's really tall. It's 3 feet to, Dennis can correct me, but and in California, I mean, it's difficult to convince a grower to put it above 2 feet. I think it's soil work, the cost of soil work, but what is ideal? I know it's a very clay soil over here, which I would venture to say that you want it even higher, but what is the perfect height of your mound or your berm?
Great question.
Mary Lou, you know that when one of those very first trials that we did on berms at South Coast Field Station, I think we built those about 2 feet high, and they settled down to about 8 inches, I believe.
Yeah, after about 10 years, they were about only 8 inches high.
Yeah, they settled down quite a bit.
Yeah, but you know,
3 feet high, I don't think any grower will do that.
well, I think you have a worker safety issue too.
Yep.
People falling off of those, especially if the berm is narrow.
They're
Derek-
they're difficult to pick. You know, the pickers are looking at fruit. They're not really looking where their feet are going, and I've seen some real problems with that.
I think it's probably where the difference in labor costs comes in. In South Africa, labor is much less expensive than over here. So when you think about picking, that makes sense for sure.
So I see Derek is showing us some of his ridges on his.
Well, I
iPhone.
wish they were mine. This is what I consider, each ridge is different. This is not mine, but this is one that I like, and I call this a swale. And it's a gentle swale. You can see the topography. It looks like your macadamia nut country in Bundaberg area there, but a swale. So it's a gentle swale, about 2 feet high. It crests. These probably were done with a grater. A lot of them know right now, and if I don't get cut off, they're generally 2 feet high. They're very angular, and I see those going in, and they're very appropriate, maybe in a very tight gem grove, and they're up to 2 feet high. I call those the Himalayas if it's in lemons, because you got to come up and over them. But this swale type is something I really like. And this
But
is
don't-
probably a nice sandy loam. So you ask why I don't, a berm depends on your drainage, your topography, other factors. We don't plan on berms all the time because of our soil types. Sandy loams, light soils are very prone to tipping over in high wind areas. So we have to find that balance between drainage and lifting a tree up in the air a couple more feet and having a little bit different root architecture than it would in its native land. As far as contour plantings, if I was on the hillsides like we have up yonder, and the Yank style is to go across, you don't berm, but you still, if you're in a heavier soil up there, you can mound. So each tree individually would have its mound. So those are my 2 suggestions. And it's a lemon grove across the street, perfectly flat. Not as
Thank you,
prone
Derek.
to do that. So I'm going to go through the canyons, lose you guys, but appreciate the chance to reconnect.
Thank you, Derek.
Thanks,
So, I
Derek.
mean, I think that the berm style would probably really depend on the soil type that you're dealing with. If you're dealing with a heavier soil, you probably do want to go a little bit higher, especially if you're in high risk of waterlogging.
Get off mute.
Mary Lou, can I excuse myself? It's almost 3 a.m. I need to get some sleep in. I've got a busy day tomorrow.
Well, thank you very much, Dennis. I'm sure everybody appreciated your comments and your willingness to get on in the wee hours of Saturday morning in advance to us. So we hope that we have as great of a Friday and get to sleep in on Saturday, unlike you.
Yeah, I'm going to sleep in on Saturday.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Dennis. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, so we have a question on chat about that. There was a comment made earlier that in 1976, I was still in college then, there was a lot of rain and Forte survived, but Hass died under this identical conditions. So are there differences between cultivars? And I would say most definitely yes. At our planning up at Lynn Cove, I showed you a picture of the Hass. Now it could be just the position the Hass was in, but we have another variety, the XX3, or is released commercially as Holiday. That variety is sensitive to everything. It's sensitive to cold, and it seems to be very sensitive to flooding, because that's a tree that's really impacted at the bottom of the field at Lynn Cove, where we had standing water for a couple weeks. So yes, I believe there probably is a strong, that there is potentially a variety effect. So then you're going to have a variety rootstock interaction potentially that we don't know. We can't tell you what it is because we don't know, but likely there is. And I think this example from 1976 would suggest that Forte might be on the same rootstock, maybe more tolerant than Hass. Gary, do you have any, Dana, do you have a comment?
Mary Lou, I have a question. The bounty that you mentioned will be probably available in 2 to 3 years. Where does it stand in terms of Phytophthora root rods?
Okay, so it's a rootstock from South Africa. I've seen it. It was one that has been widely planted in some of Alabeste's Maluma plantings. And it has always done well in replant situations and in heavy rain situations. It was imported into California by Alvatopia, which is a new nursery. It's just cleared quarantine. And so it's not likely that I can ask Lorena, maybe you can address when you anticipate that you'll have the first trees available, because Lorena is associated with Alvatopia.
I am not sure. Like we said, it just cleared quarantine and we haven't started working on it, but I am assuming probably, yeah, like I said, 2-3 years. I can come back and confirm to the team or, to the group. But at this
Okay,
point,
that would be great, I think. Great question though about bounty. Do we have any other questions or comments?
On the rootstock breeding, in the rootstock breeding program, do we have on the agenda looking into tolerant rootstocks to flooding, or it's out of the scope for California?
I don't know.
Well, I didn't understand the question. You want to repeat that?
Yes, no, I'm asking, I'm not sure if in rootstock breeding program, we have any plan to look into our rootstocks in terms of tolerance to flooding, which I should ask Patty.
You should ask Patty, because that's Patty's purview.
Yep.
Yeah, I doubt that, actually. I mean, got so many other things to look at, but
Exactly.
I doubt that.
Not a big priority, I suppose.
Yeah,
Actually, yes, Patty is looking at that in addition to laurel wilt. But yeah, she's looking at Phytophthora as well.
yeah. So Phytophthora soil interactions. So I was just reminded that earlier on, we had a question about using nano bubbles to put oxygen into the irrigation water. And the idea is, would that work? And I was reminded that Bruce Schaefer in Florida did look at that, but I honestly don't remember what Bruce Schaefer found out in that study. And so I really, it seems to me that you wouldn't be, if you're flooded, you're not going to be irrigated, because as Dennis said, you would turn off the irrigation water at least for some time. So it doesn't seem to me that by oxygenating the irrigation water, at least under a flooding situation, is going to assist you, because you don't want to add more water into the system. But I'll look into that, and when Lorena sends a little email about bounty, I'll look into Bruce Schaefer's report and see what I can find out about that.
We've tried out there are a few products out there and tools that would produce those nano bubbles, but the main concept is getting oxygen to that root zone. And you're right, it works best with drip irrigated type crops, where you could run it even if it's flooded. In sprinkler and overhead, I don't see how that would get that oxygen to the root zone to help where it's needed, because those bubbles in the water stream can only stay in there for so long, and then they're released back to reach an equilibrium with the atmosphere. So you're right, you'll just be adding more water to the root zone, which doesn't help. But if you had a drip system, especially subsurface, it could help the roots.
Okay, well, great. Thanks, John.
There's a company, Moliere, that actually sent me a case study this week, and I haven't looked at it yet, but it was positive results for avocados. And I wonder if it's not something you can use as preventative, as if you forecast a big rain event, to start with a highly oxygenated soil before the rain comes. It could almost work as sort of preventative forecast of action. But on another point, is there any lab, any nursery in California that's doing the microclonal propagation that Alice Bester and the late Andre Ahrens and them have done? Is there any nursery in California that does that?
Lorena?
We are currently working on that as Avotopia.
Excellent.
And I believe Subtropica Nursery in Fallbrook also is doing the Ernst method.
Yes, that's true.
So there's 2 nurseries that are using the Ernst method. But I think as we learned in the avocado brainstorming in Australia and also in meeting in New Zealand, the future probably really is tissue culture. We're not there yet, but we're starting down that path. And probably within 5 to 10 years, the tissue culture will be the mainstream rather. I think tissue culture will be the mainstream rather than anything we're doing now. But we'll have to wait and see. Each rootstock is going to need a different protocol. So it may not be easily done as we introduce new rootstocks to get those rootstocks into tissue culture. But I think the results coming out of Australia, we went to a commercial nursery in Queensland, and it was very, very impressive to see the trees they have. They're just going commercial now. They've been giving growers trees for the last 2 or 3 years, and they're satisfied with the results, at least for a couple of the rootstocks, and they plan to go commercial now here very shortly with tissue culture grown trees. And then Anderson Nursery in Queensland is using Nina Mitter's protocol, and he has gone commercial as well. So we have one last question in chat. I see, so this question is approaching the twilight zone, but in areas prone to flooding, what about subsurface compressed air injection through buried perforated drip lines? Well, John, I think that's a great question. I don't have an answer to that, but does anybody else? Be very expensive for, how often do we have severe flooding events in California? I don't know. It's a very good question.
Well, in San Diego County, not near enough to have the expense of doing that, you know. There were some areas that I don't know if Ben Faber is still on the line, but up in Santa Barbara County, I remember in heavy clay soils, they sort of achieved the same thing with berms. You know, they just that worked out for them.
Yeah. Well, I think we've reached 10 o'clock. I want to thank Fatima and Gary for being part of the panel today. I want to thank all of you for attending and for the questions on chat as well as in-person comments. And I hope to see you all. We will get a notice out about the meeting the end of May that'll feature Udi Gaffney from Israel and Guy Whitney. I'm sure many of us would like to see
Yeah.
Guy again. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary Lou.
Thank you.
Thank you.